Greeting to our YouTube viewers. I am Vanguard Mackenzie. I'm making this video because I was watching a documentary on YouTube by this historian explaining that not all the people who were given the name as the so-called black people came from out of what the Roman did name as Africa, that later became known as Africa by the English and Saxon Germanic people, from where the dialect that became known as the English or Anglish language came from, when they became literate people able to read and write by way of the Roman and the Roman Catholic Church, who many of these people were enslaved and ruled by. The point I'm trying to make here is this. Although YouTube, in my opinion, is a good site to gain knowledge and enlightenment from, yet I have heard many false history and false statements made on YouTube by various historians of knowledge. My reason for saying this historian is completely wrong in his statement he made on YouTube, because according to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 10 to verse 13, the verse make it quite clear that the Garden of Eden, where all the human family is coming from, came from out of what became known as East Africa. So what the scripture is telling us is that all the people who were given the name as the black people and the African people came from what became known as East Africa, of the so-called Middle East of the people of Ham. So although the Gentile people of what became known as the European people of Europe, who has translated the scripture that became known as the Bible by the people of Greece, who later became known as the Greek people, who translate the scripture from Hebrew to Aramaic of the alphabetical writing system of the Canaanite Phoenician people, that eventually came down into Greek, Latin, and into the various barbarian dialects of Europe, that originally came from the various Asian kingdoms of the people of Ham that's gone by. The Gentile people of Europe have translated the scripture by putting various pictures of the people of Europe as the original people of the scripture of the Asian world, where all the people of today is coming from. This they do to give the reader of the scripture the impression to think that the people of the Asian world were European-looking people, who they name as the white people. Just to give one a good example of the falsehood and lies of these Gentile people of Japheth that became known as the European people. Many times watching the internet, they often show pictures of Yahweh looking like a Gentile man of Europe, who no man of today has ever had the opportunity to see what Yahweh looked like, because Yahweh made it quite clear to Moses that is written at Exodus chapter 33 and verse 3 to verse 23. There Yahweh said to Moses that no man can see his face and live, but he allowed Moses to see his back part of what he looked like, so he would not die. So Moses and Abraham were the only two men who were that fortunate to be in the presence of Yahweh and live. Yet these Gentile European people of Japheth, as the audacity and the deceitfulness to show a picture of Yahweh on the internet looking like a man of Europe, who they cannot see and look upon and live, if that was possible for them to do so. Also, many times watching the internet, they oftentimes show pictures of the prophets and that of the ancient children of Israel looking like the people of Europe, who they have never seen and who they name as Jews and Jewish people, that were taken from the Latin word Judah. Furthermore, many of the ancient children of Israel were dark-skinned looking people, because they came from out of the many granddaughters of the people of Ham, who gave birth to this nation of people and also who they were living among. Also, many of the children of Israel mothers came from the Canaanite, the Babylonians, and from the people of Mizraim, who became known as the Egyptian people, who they also came out of as a nation of people. Furthermore, the only time the ancient children of Israel had any dealing with the people of Europe is when Yahweh allowed the Greeks and the Romans, who were ruling over what became known as North Africa and the so-called Middle East, to take the children of Israel as captives into Europe for not pleasing him and not sticking to his laws and commandments he made with them through the prophet Moses and that of other prophets of the children of Israel. The same is true for Yeshua, who became known as Jesus and Christ in the Greek and Latin language of the Roman. So many times watching the internet, they often show pictures of Yeshua looking like a European man of Europe who had an heavenly beginning before he was sent to earth by Yahweh to be born as a man in the flesh and to sacrifice his life for the sin of Israel and that of the world of other people who believe and follow his teaching of the new covenant law Yahweh gave to him to establish before his sacrificial death. So many times they often show pictures of Yeshua, who went back to heaven over 2,000 years ago, before many of these modern powers of the people of Europe of today came about, who they have never seen. The same is true for the Philistine people, who was a tribe that came from the people of Mizraim, of what became known as Egypt, of the Gaza Strip of the so-called Middle East, of the land of Canaan. Many times watching the internet, they often show pictures of these Amite people of the Asian world that's gone by, looking like the people of Europe, who they have never seen, because many of these Asian kingdoms of the people of Am were destroyed by Yahweh long before these modern kingdoms of the people of Europe came about. The same is true for King Nebuchadnezzar of ancient Babylon, who was one of the kings of the various kingdoms of Nimrod, who was the last son of Cush, and who had 4 kingdoms in the land of Shinar, of what is known today as the Persian Gulf, of the land of Canaan, of the so-called Middle East. So different time watching the internet and YouTube, they often show a picture of Nebuchadnezzar looking like a European man of Europe, who they have never seen, because many of these ancient kingdoms of the people of Am were destroyed thousands of years ago by Yahweh, before these European powers of today came about. But these Gentile people of Europe do these things to deceive many of us, their captive people, who do not have much knowledge of the scripture and of the ancient world that's gone by. But as I had mentioned in one of my videos, that many of the people of Japheth are full of lies and falsehood to deceive many of their captives who do not know any better. But in reality, many of the people of the Asian world were dark-skinned looking people. I want this historian of YouTube to know that the scripture is the word of Yahweh that became known as the Bible by the people of Greece. And the scripture was only given to the ancient children of Israel to live and walk by, that it may please Yahweh if they should live and walk by his word, the scripture, that it may go well with them if they were to do so, to save them from the wrath and destruction of Yahweh for being disobedient. So the scripture is of true history, that has all the true record from where the human family came from, that a person can put their trust and faith in, and can believe what is written there, because Yahweh is the creator and father of all living, whether it is of human, animal, or anything else for that matter. So there is no doubt that all the family of planet Earth came from what became known as Africa, of the land of Am, and what became known as the so-called Middle East, of the people of Am, of the Asian world that's gone by. What this historian on YouTube failed to understand, that one of the reasons why many dark-skinned people can be found around the world, in different islands and other places, apart from many who were taken as slaves by the Gentile people of Europe to their captured lands from the native, who they had enslaved and slaughtered after death, and many Amite people were brought over to replace them as the new slave to what became known as the Americas and what became known as the West Indies by Columbus, by using the Bible and what became known as Christianity to their own advantage to get rich from slave labor. This is also true for the Ishmaelite people of what became known as the Saudi Arabian people of the so-called Middle East, of the land of Ramah, of the Mohammedan Muslim people with their religious worship to their God Allah, that they had indoctrinated many of their captive people to believe in as a religious way of life for them to follow and live by. So apart from the slave experience of many dark-skinned Amite people, one of the reasons why many dark-skinned people can be found around the world in different places, it is because, as it is so written in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 8, that Yahweh confused the language of the people of Nimrod and his companion who were building the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven. And Yahweh also scattered the people throughout the earth. So from then came the different language or dialect many people speak today as their language. This was after the flood of Noah. Because according to Genesis chapter 11 and verse 1, all the people of the earth of that time used to speak the same language and were living very closely together in what became known as Africa and the so-called Middle East, of the land of Canaan, of the scripture that called as the land of Shinar, that is known today as the Persian Gulf. Of the area, the Greek name as Mesopotamia, that meant to the Greek land between two rivers, which is speaking of the Euphrates and the Tigris River area of the land of Canaan, where Nimrod had various kingdoms there, such as Syria, that was close to the rear of the land of Iran, that became known as Iraq by the conquest of the Mohammedan Muslim people of what became known as the Saudi Arabian people of Ishmael. When looking at the scripture map of 1890, showing of the land area of the Asian world of that time. So the land of Iran that became known as Iraq was also one of the kingdom of Nimrod, that is in the land area of Shinar, of what became known as the Persian Gulf of the land of Canaan. I also want to point out that the kingdom of Babylon was also one of the kingdom of Nimrod that was located in the land area of Shinar, where Nimrod and his companion was building the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven. So the name Babylon was taken from the Tower of Babel. I also want to point out that the Amite people of Carthage, of the land area that became known as Morocco and Algeria, where the land of Carthage were also located, before the kingdom of Carthage was destroyed by the Roman army. So the people of Carthage had rulership over 3/4 of the island of Sicily under their rulership, and the Greek also had rulership over the other quarter of the island of Sicily, before Carthage and the Greek were destroyed by the Roman, who took over all the colonies of Carthage and that of Greece. So the people of Carthage also had rulership over the island of Sardinia, Cyprus, Malta, Spain, and a city in what became known as France, and many other areas around the world before they were defeated and destroyed. I also want to point out that the Phoenician people who came from the first son of Canaan, who were known as Zidon, of the country that became known as Syria, by the conquest of the Greeks, meaning Alexander the Great and his Greek settlers, who had settled in the land of Zidon before the Romans became strong and destroyed Greece and take over all the Greek colonies that came under the rulership of the Romans. So the Phoenician people of what became known as the land of Syria had different settlements around the world before they were defeated by the Persian, the children of Israel, with the power of Yahweh behind them, as the scripture clearly explained. Also the Greeks and the Romans, who took over all the settlement of the Phoenician people. Also the Phoenician people of Carthage were the first sailors before the Greek, Roman, and also the Viking Germanic people of Europe. So it's a good possibility they, the Phoenician, had different settlement around the Pacific that gave birth to the people of the Fiji Island and what became known as Indonesia by the Dutch rulership, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippine Islands that were conquered by Spain from the native Amite people who were living there in the era. This was before the coming of the Spanish, who came and took over the island and washed out many of these Amite looking people into their melting pot of different shade of people. The same is true for the Chinese people who also came along and washed out many of these Amite people of the Philippine Island into their melting pot of different shade of people. This is the reason why many people of the Philippine Island, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and many other people of the era, with that of the Chinese man blood and the European man blood running through these people's veins. I also want to point out that many of the people of the land of Bharat that became known as India, Bangladesh, and what became known as Pakistan were of a darker shade of looking people before the Greek and the Roman rulership that gave birth to the name India. This is also true before the conquest of the Portuguese and the British, who came along and pushed out the Portuguese and took over the land area of India as their colony and melt out these dark-skinned looking people into their melting pot of different shade of people. One see in what became known as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Many people of today would not believe that these people of the era came from out of the dark-skinned people who were the true native of the land before the coming of the people of Europe, who came along and melt out many of these dark-skinned people into their melting pot of different shade of people. I also want to thank this historian of YouTube for bringing to the attention of the viewers of YouTube of the many dark-skinned people who can be found around the world in different places, who were the original native of these places. I also want to say that the island of Jamaica is becoming a melting pot of different shade of people, that if the world was to last for another 50 years, many of the Amite people of Jamaica would look like many of the people of the Philippine Island, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, because many of these people of these places had a strong European blood running through their veins. because many of these places were conquered by the people of Europe as their colonies and left their many offspring behind to carry on with their political system of rulership. And they have oppressed many of these natives to be their footcloth. So many of these natives try to melt out themselves into off-breed looking European looking people because many of them are suffering from colonial and slavery mentality. I want to point out that the island of Indonesia, with many other places of the era, were conquered by the Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, French, and later by the British. But the Dutch were able to push out the other European powers and take over full control of the island of Indonesia. And they have enslaved many of these native Amite people of the era. I also want to point out that it's such a shame to see how much the people of Europe have been using the Amite people and their talent to their own advantage to bring glory and fame to these people. My reason for saying this, it is because the British, Dutch, French, German, and the British settlers of what became known as the United States of America, and the British and French settlers of what became known as the Canadian people, have been using many Amite people who they name as black people to be their track and field runners, to bring glory and fame to these people. These were the same people who has been our murderers, slave masters, and our oppressors for many centuries, and who also have robbed us of our history. But many times these Amite people who they use to bring their fame and glory to them cannot even walk or drive down the street in peace without being brutalized and harassed and killed by their police force system. But when it comes down to many of these Amite track and field runners, they have no consciousness of themselves and their history as a people, because they are sleeping and dreaming, and the only time they will wake up is when they have been oppressed and kept down and cannot go forward in life because of the oppression from these same people who they bring their fame and glory to. I also want to say that my ancestors who were brought over to the island of Jamaica, the British had taken away from the power of the Spanish and named the island as Jamaica, that was taken from the Arawak name Escamaica, who Columbus did name as St. Jago. The point I'm trying to make is this. My ancestors who were brought to the island as slaves to replace the Arawaks as a new slave had died and left for their offspring to inherit and benefit from their legacy of their cultured food that was taken from the land of Am, they name as Africa. Yet there are many Chinese and European people who are there in Jamaica and who has the monopoly in the restaurant and the hotel business, selling our ancestors' cultured food to tourists and other people to gain wealth. I am not implying that there are not many Amite people of Jamaica who have restaurants and selling their own cultural food, but it should be the Amite people of Jamaica having monopoly over selling their own ancestral cultural food that was left for them to inherit. But many Amite people of Jamaica are not conscious about many of these things I have mentioned. I would also like to point out that when it comes down to the British people of Europe, they are very patriotic people over their culture and their cultural food. And they would not allow any Amite people to come to Britain to have monopoly over selling their fish and chips business, food business, which is a part of their culture, like many Amite people of Jamaica would do. Although I came to the knowledge that white potatoes from where French fry and fish and chip came from was taken from the Inca people of Peru that was introduced to Europe by the Spanish because they had rulership over the Inca people. So this white potato became a national dish for the people of Europe because they were having a famine in Europe at the time when this potato was introduced into Europe. I also want to mention that I was watching YouTube, and this European lady of Jamaica, who I suppose is a lawyer of Jamaica, she was explaining about the corruption of the police force system of Jamaica that came down from the political system of the British during the colonial days of the British rulership over the island. She was explaining about many of the police officers who prey upon many young men of Jamaica by way of violence and killing, because, as she put it, they are poor and black. So, in other words, a European person or a Chinese person of Jamaica can get away with all sorts of crime because they have the money power and they are considered as the high class people of Jamaica because they have money. So, as I have mentioned before, that when it comes down to many Amite people of Jamaica and in many other places, they are suffering from slavery and colonial mentality of stupidity, especially when it comes down to many Amite police officers of the British system that was established by the British as a protection for the settlers who were known as the colonists against many of their conquered slave people of their rulership. So today, many of my people join the European police force system because it's a good paying job with all sorts of fringe benefit, and they forget about where they and their ancestors is coming from because they are no longer a part of the struggling people because they have a good paycheck coming in to them every week or a month. So many of these Amite police officers became a part of the oppressors and enemy of their own people struggling because they are now living the good life of the European colonial slavery system to get rich that they did establish from slave labor. So many of these Amite police officers of the European colonial system are suffering from slavery mentality and stupidity, and that do affect their thinking and their action toward their own suffering and struggling people. This European lawyer went on to explain that many of the violence of the Kingston era of Jamaica came from the political system of Jamaica that was established by the British. So many of these political candidates running for office gave guns to many of their supporters to fight against their political rival and their supporters to prevent them from voting for their candidate so that they can win the election to put them in office. I also want to point out that many of the violence of Jamaica came from the gangsters and the cowboy movies that came from the United States to many of the islands of the West Indies. So many young men of Jamaica watched the cowboy movies and gangster movies, and they became influenced by what they see on the television and also in the cowboy and the gangster movies that they copy, and it became a part of their lifestyle of violence and robbery to make money, just like what they see in the movies and on the television of the European people. So, as the saying goes, monkey see and monkey do, meaning people always want to follow what other people doing. So this is how the violence and the crime wave came about in Jamaica, plus the guns that were shipped down from the United States, Europe, China, and other places that had great impact on many people's minds of Jamaica toward violence and killing. I could remember when I was growing up in Jamaica in the 50s, life was a little bit more peaceful and less violence apart from the political violence to put different candidates into political office. Plus, there were many more of us Amite people of the island of Jamaica and less European people, although they were the ones who were taking away the island from what became known as the West Indies and the Caribbean from the native Arawak people, and brought many Amite people from the land of Am as the new slave to replace the Arawaks and the Carib, who were the first slave for the people of Europe of their captured New World that became known as the Americas and the West Indies, that later became known as the Caribbean by these same people of Europe. So many of these people were enslaved and slaughtered off to death, and their land were taken away to make wealth for the people of Europe, to become rich people. So it was the people of Europe who did establish their crime wave of violence and killing to get rich, that many people later copied from the people of Europe as a way of life of violence and killing. I am not implying that the Amite people who were brought over from the land of Am to replace the various natives as the new slave were all innocent people, because many of them who were brought over was wrapped up in witchcraft and jealousy against each other. But in my time growing up in Jamaica, life were more peaceful than how it is now in the European tourist system. So this tourist business system that the people of Jamaica and many islands depend upon to make a living from the European tourist business. So in my opinion, many young people of Jamaica need job opportunities to better their standard of living, to take them from out of povertyness. They also need togetherness and self-awareness, and for them to stop from running away from themselves, trying to look like the people of Europe, who many Amite people were taught to see as high-class people because they have the money power that came down from the colonial slavery days of the people of Europe, mapping up the world to be their conquered people. I also want to point out that I was watching YouTube about some Dutch settlers of what became known as South Africa, who have the audacity and the impertinency to say they are going to establish a white or a European only community of South Africa, where no so-called blacks or African people are allowed to enter. First, I must say that is such a shame to see how these so-called Amite political leaders of South Africa, who see themselves as leaders of their own people, could allow these Dutch invaders who see themselves as native of what became known as South Africa to establish and set up a European only community in the land of Am of their forefathers, where many of their own people are not allowed because they have the might of the guns, and also because they're a warrior barbarian type of people who love to make war and love to conquer other people's land to get the wealth from the land. This situation could never happen in Europe, where some Amite people could say they are going to establish an Amite community where no European are not allowed. It would cause a war to break out, and many of these Amite people would lose their life if such a thing was to take place in Europe. But many of these foolish Amite political leaders of South Africa just sit back and allow these things to take place, because many of them are suffering from slavery and colonial mentality of stupidity to allow these things to take place in their forefathers' land. So in my opinion, many of these Dutch settlers of South Africa need to pack up and go back to Europe from where they came from before, and leave the Amite people in their own land era to have peace of mind, living among their own people in their Yahweh given lands. Thank you, YouTube, for giving me this opportunity to elaborate on this video. I want to say here, I am not here to get subscribers or to bring fame to myself. But the point is, many Amite people are in total darkness of ignorancy, and they need knowledge and need enlightenment. And many of the things that I've written are mentioned in this video. They have no knowledge of these things. Not only them, but many other people elsewhere. So I put out myself to bring out this knowledge to the people of and to other people, because it needs to be known. And I know the European people have tried to keep these things under the carpet because they don't want this history to come out. They want us to keep us on the darkness and to believe what they have taught us for centuries and to see things their way. But the truth have to be told whether one like it or not. And this is it. Give thanks to Yahweh, through Yeshua Lord.